The Pacific Sky, Summer 1942. A canopy of blue stretched endlessly over rolling waves, while beneath it, two very different machines carved trails of smoke across the air. On one side, the Japanese Mitsubishi Zero, sleek, light, and impossibly agile. It danced through the sky with a grace that seemed untouchable. To its pilots, this aircraft was the embodiment of dominance, a blade sharper than anything the Allies could wield. And on the other side, the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, a stubby, heavier machine, slower, less responsive, and mocked even by the men who flew against it. Japanese aviators laughed, calling it clumsy, outdated, a flying coffin for the Americans who dared challenge the Zero's supremacy. But war is not won on appearances alone. Hidden inside the Wildcat was a different kind of power. Armor where the Zero had none, fuel protection where the Zero was fatally exposed, and a set of heavy machine guns that could transform a single firing pass into a storm of destruction. The stage was set. What began as ridicule would soon turn into shock as the slow Wildcat rewrote the story of the Pacific skies. The opening months of the Pacific War were a storm the Allies could not contain. On December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier planes struck Pearl Harbor, crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Within hours, bases from the Philippines to Malaya and Wake Island fell under the same relentless onslaught. Japan's aerial weapon of choice in this expansion was the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. The Zero had entered service only a year earlier, and by 1941 it had become the terror of the Pacific. Its unmatched maneuverability, astonishing range of over 1,100 miles, and blistering climb rate shocked every opponent it faced. In China, where Japanese pilots had already tested it against poorly equipped adversaries, the aircraft carved out an aura of invincibility. Now, in the Pacific, it confronted the United States Navy and Marine Corps, and proved no less deadly. American forces scrambled to respond. Their frontline fighter was the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, an aircraft first flown in 1937 and already showing its age by the time war erupted. Compared to the Zero, the Wildcat looked like a compromise. It was slower, heavier, and less nimble. Its range was limited. Its cockpit visibility was worse. In the air, Japanese aviators often found themselves circling easily around it, describing their American adversaries as trapped, unable to match the Zero's turning ability. The early record confirmed this grim picture. At Wake Island in December 1941, Marine Corps Wildcats fought desperately against Japanese raids. Despite courage and some victories, their small numbers were overwhelmed. In the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies, the pattern repeated itself. Wherever Zeros appeared, Allied fighters fell in alarming numbers. Yet beneath the statistics, a more complex reality was beginning to form. The Wildcat's design philosophy was entirely different from that of the Zero. Where the Japanese had built for speed and agility, Grumman engineers had built for survival. The Wildcat's rugged frame could absorb punishment that would rip a Zero apart. It had armor plating to protect the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks to prevent fires, and 6 heavy .50 caliber Browning machine guns. These features carried weight, but they gave the Wildcat something the Zero lacked: resilience. This distinction was not immediately obvious. In the cockpit, American pilots felt the imbalance keenly. They knew they could not simply outturn or outrun the Zero. Many entered combat convinced they were climbing into a machine that put them at a fatal disadvantage. Some described the experience as flying into battle with the odds stacked heavily against them. The reputation of the Zero spread so widely that some Allied squadrons referred to it simply as the super fighter. But slowly, a shift was coming. A handful of encounters revealed that the Wildcat was not as helpless as it first appeared. Pilots noticed that when they fired a burst at close range, the Zero's light construction made it extraordinarily vulnerable. A few well-placed hits could tear wings from the frame or ignite fuel tanks. Survivors of dogfights returned with bullet holes stitched across their fuselage, but still alive, still flying. The Wildcat could take punishment, and that quality would prove crucial in the months to come. By early 1942, the Pacific was poised for a test of endurance. Japan, flush with victory, believed its naval air arm unstoppable. The United States, still reeling from Pearl Harbor and retreating across Asia, was preparing for a longer struggle. In this struggle, the unglamorous Wildcat would become the frontline guardian of U.S. carriers and island outposts. The stage was shifting toward a series of clashes that would define air combat in the Pacific. At Coral Sea, Midway, and later over the Solomon Islands, the Wildcat would face the Zero not in theory, but in relentless daily combat. What had begun as ridicule from Japanese pilots would soon turn into a duel measured not by elegance, but by attrition, resilience, and tactical innovation. And to understand how this balance evolved, we must first look deeper into the machinery itself, the strengths and flaws of both aircraft, and the men who flew them. To grasp why the Wildcat was underestimated, one must examine the machines side by side. The Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0, introduced in 1940, was designed for offensive dominance. Its engineers stripped away every ounce of unnecessary weight to maximize agility. It carried two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns, enough to devastate lightly armored opponents. With a top speed of around 331 miles per hour and a turning radius unmatched by any Allied fighter in the Pacific, the Zero could dictate the flow of combat. Most striking was its range, nearly 2,000 miles, made possible by large fuel tanks in its wings. This allowed Japanese carriers to strike farther than their enemies ever expected. By contrast, the Grumman F-4F Wildcat embodied a philosophy of compromise. Its maximum speed barely touched 318 miles per hour. Its climb rate lagged far behind the Zeros. Its range was half as long. In a turning contest, the Wildcat always lost. The Zero could spiral around it, forcing the American pilot into a defensive fight. Even on paper, the Wildcat appeared obsolete the moment war began. But design is never just numbers. The Wildcat carried 650 caliber Browning machine guns, heavier firepower than the Zero's mix of weapons. Its armor plating, though heavy, saved lives. Self-sealing fuel tanks meant that a Wildcat struck by gunfire often survived, while a Zero hit in the same way could ignite instantly. Japanese engineers had sacrificed protection for performance, and in combat, this trade-off grew more apparent. Beyond the machines, there was another gulf: training. In 1941, the Japanese Navy Air Service fielded perhaps the most elite carrier aviators in the world. Their training regimen demanded years of grueling preparation, selecting only the most gifted pilots. By the outbreak of war, Japan's frontline squadrons were filled with men who had already flown extensively in China. They were combat veterans with unmatched confidence and skill. American pilots, by comparison, were often fresh from accelerated training programs. The U.S. Navy had expanded rapidly, and many aviators entering combat in early 1942 had logged fewer hours than their Japanese counterparts. They were brave but inexperienced, thrown into a brutal aerial environment against a foe that had already mastered its doctrine. This imbalance shaped the early months of the Pacific War. Japanese pilots, not only, flew a machine they considered superior. They believed themselves superior as individuals. Accounts from Zero pilots describe dismissing the Wildcat as a lumbering target, something to be toyed with before delivering the kill. In the skies over the Philippines, Java, and early carrier battles, this confidence seemed justified. Kill ratios ran heavily in Japan's favor. Yet cracks were forming. The Zero's dominance depended on certain conditions: surprise, maneuvering room, and the ability to dictate the fight. When American pilots began refusing to play by those rules, the equation shifted. Rather than turn with a Zero, U.S. aviators learned to dive away, using the Wildcats' sturdier frame to withstand steep descents that might tear lighter planes apart. They learned that if they stayed alive long enough, a single firing pass with their heavy machine guns could even the odds. The strategic picture reinforced this slow adaptation. Japan, though dominant, was locked into a war of attrition it could not afford. Each Zero pilot lost was nearly irreplaceable, the product of years of selective training. America, though reeling, had an industrial engine capable of producing more planes and more pilots in months. For the United States, the Wildcat was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to endure, to hold the line until better machines arrived. The coming battles would test this philosophy to the breaking point. By mid-1942, the United States was preparing for its first real counteroffensive. At Coral Sea and then at Midway, Wildcats flew from carriers to guard dive bombers and torpedo planes. Losses were heavy, but they bought time and protection for strikes that crippled Japanese carriers. And soon after, at Guadalcanal, the Wildcat would face its most demanding trial: daily combat against the Zero, in brutal conditions, with no room for error. It was there that tactics, innovation, and sheer resilience would begin to transform the Wildcat's reputation. The machine that once seemed too slow, too outdated, would prove capable of something far more important than elegance. It could survive. It could fight, and it could keep fighting long after its opponent's strength began to wane. And this brings us to the next layer of the story. Not just the background, but the many angles, human, tactical, and technological, that explain how a clumsy fighter held its own against the legend of the Zero. War in the air is measured not only in machinery, but in the men who strapped themselves into cockpits and faced death at arm's length. For the American pilots of 1942, flying the Wildcat was a test of nerves before it was ever a test of skill. Accounts from those early months describe the sinking feeling of climbing into a fighter already known to be slower, less agile, and seemingly outclassed. Many new Navy and Marine aviators believed their odds of survival were slim. They had read the reports from Wake Island, from the Philippines, from Coral Sea, stories of Zeros cutting through Allied fighters with devastating efficiency. But men adapt. Courage becomes a form of calculation. Wildcat pilots began to treat their aircraft not as a dueling blade, but as a shield, a weapon of resilience. They flew knowing they could not turn with the Zero. Instead, they banked on the one thing they could count on: surviving long enough to make their guns speak. Marine Captain Marion Carl, one of the first American aces of the war, later described how pilots learned discipline in the face of fear. He recalled that if a Wildcat pilot panicked and tried to turn inside a Zero, he was dead. But if he trusted his machine, used its dive speed, and chose his moment to fire, he had a chance. This mindset, restraint, patience, survival, became the cornerstone of Wildcat operations. Psychologically, it also hardened the men who flew it. Each mission over Guadalcanal or during a carrier engagement meant watching squadron mates disappear in smoke, knowing replacements were scarce. It demanded calm in chaos. A young pilot who returned from a sortie with bullet holes across his fuselage, but still alive, began to understand what the Wildcat truly offered: durability, and by extension, a fighting chance. The Wildcat's design told a very different story than the Zeros. The Mitsubishi A6M was a marvel of engineering stripped down to its essentials. Japanese designers cut every ounce of unnecessary weight. No armor, no self-sealing tanks, minimal protection to maximize agility. The Zero could dance through the sky with unrivaled grace, but its airframe was thin, its pilot exposed, its tanks vulnerable. The Wildcat, by contrast, embodied the Grumman philosophy of ironworks. It was not sleek. It was not elegant, but it was tough. Its structure could absorb punishment, that would tear a Zero apart. A Wildcat hit by cannon fire often returned to base, riddled with holes but intact. Pilots called it a flying tank, and though the nickname was half in jest, the truth was undeniable. Its 6 Browning 50 caliber machine guns were another critical factor. Heavy, reliable, and devastating at close range, they gave the Wildcat a punch the Zero often could not withstand. A Zero's lightly built wings and fuselage disintegrated under the hammering of those guns. A burst that might only wound another aircraft could shred a Japanese fighter in seconds. Self-sealing fuel tanks further tilted the balance. Many Zero pilots perished not from bullets, but from fire. A single incendiary round could ignite wing tanks, turning the aircraft into a fireball. Wildcats, though slower, had a measure of protection. Many American pilots returned from combat, with leaking tanks sealed by rubber linings, alive to fight again. Yet these strengths came at a cost. The Wildcat was heavier and less maneuverable. Its range limited its ability to project power deep into enemy territory. It demanded that pilots resist the instinct to chase or dogfight in circles. Instead, it forced them to innovate, to think differently about how to fight a more agile opponent. From a purely technical perspective, the Wildcat looked inferior on the drafting board. But combat proved that resilience, firepower, and survivability could matter as much as speed or agility. The Japanese laughed at the Wildcat's clumsiness. They did not laugh when its guns tore through their unarmored frames. By 1942, this difference in design philosophy was becoming apparent to both sides. Japanese pilots retained their edge in maneuverability and confidence, but American aviators were beginning to realize that their slow fighter had hidden teeth. It was no longer simply about surviving. It was about learning to exploit the Wildcat's strengths deliberately, turning weakness into opportunity. And this bridge between man and machine set the stage for the tactical revolution that would follow. Out of necessity, American pilots would invent new ways of fighting in the sky, tactics that maximized the Wildcat's toughness while neutralizing the Zero's agility. It was here that innovation would tilt the balance of the Pacific Air War. Innovation in war often comes not from superiority, but from necessity. Nowhere is this clearer than in the invention of the Thatch Weave. Lieutenant Commander John S. Thatch, a veteran naval aviator, studied reports of the Zero before he ever encountered one in combat. Reading the accounts, he understood the Wildcat could not win a turning fight. The Zero's agility was too great. But he also realized the Wildcat's durability and firepower could be exploited, if only pilots fought in pairs rather than alone. His solution was deceptively simple. 2 Wildcats flew parallel courses a short distance apart. When a Zero attacked one of them, the threatened pilot turned toward his wingman. The wingman, in turn, crossed over and aimed directly at the attacker. The maneuver created a deadly crossing pattern. No matter which Wildcat the Zero pursued, it would fly directly into the guns of the other. First tested in training exercises, the tactic drew skepticism. Pilots wondered if it would work under the speed and chaos of real combat. But in the summer of 1942, during clashes in the Coral Sea and especially at Midway, the Thatch Weave proved its worth. Wildcat pilots using it not only survived, they scored kills against Zeros. The tactic soon became standard practice. It turned the Wildcat from an underdog into a coordinated predator. Alone, a Wildcat struggled. Together, in disciplined formation, they turned the Zero's agility into a liability. The lesson was clear. Technology mattered, but teamwork could rewrite the balance of power in the sky. For the Japanese, early success bred a dangerous confidence. The Zero dominated the opening months of the war with an aura of invincibility. Pilots, many of them hardened veterans of China, believed their skill and aircraft made them untouchable. This confidence shaped their doctrine: aggressive attacks, turning fights, and relentless pursuit. But this approach carried hidden weaknesses. By building their fighters so lightly, Japanese engineers left their pilots vulnerable to even brief bursts of heavy fire. The lack of armor and self-sealing tanks meant that small mistakes had catastrophic consequences. Yet the culture of aerial combat within the Imperial Japanese Navy encouraged risk-taking and close-in dogfights. Overconfidence also blinded Japanese commanders to the realities of attrition. Their pilot training program was elite, but it was also slow and selective. Each lost veteran was nearly irreplaceable. In 1942, the pool of experienced aviators that had won victory after victory could not be replenished at the same rate. Every Zero pilot shot down by a Wildcat was a deeper wound to Japan's long-term strength. American aviators noticed this attitude. Pilots returning from Guadalcanal described Japanese opponents pressing attacks recklessly, confident in their ability to outturn or outclimb any adversary. When those attacks were met by disciplined Wildcats flying in pairs or groups, the result was often deadly for the Zero. What began as laughter at a slow enemy machine turned gradually into respect, and sometimes surprise, when that machine refused to fall and instead struck back with brutal efficiency. The duel between the Zero and the Wildcat was more than a contest of engineering. It symbolized two very different approaches to war. Japan's Zero was elegant, graceful, and lethal in the hands of an expert. It embodied the offensive spirit of a nation seeking rapid expansion, but its very strengths concealed fragility. It was a blade sharpened too thin, designed for immediate supremacy rather than sustained survival. The Wildcat, by contrast, was never meant to dazzle. It was not the fastest nor the most agile, but it represented the American approach to industrial war. Build machines that can take damage, fight again, and hold the line long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Its toughness mirrored the broader American strategy, absorbing early defeats, learning quickly, and leaning on industrial resilience to grind down an opponent who could not replace what was lost. For the pilots, this difference was more than theory. It shaped morale. The Zero's aura of invincibility could intimidate, but once broken, it collapsed into vulnerability. The Wildcat's reputation was the reverse. At first derided, even by those who flew it, it slowly earned respect as a machine that kept its pilot alive. That survival meant experience gained, lessons carried forward, and the chance to return to battle. Wiser than before, this contrast, fragile, brilliance versus rugged endurance, foreshadowed the larger outcome of the Pacific War. Japan's early edge could not withstand the grinding pressure of American adaptation and production, and the Wildcat, unglamorous as it seemed, was the bridge that carried U.S. naval aviation through the darkest year until stronger machines like the Hellcat arrived. By the end of 1942, the laughter of Japanese pilots was beginning to fade. The slow Wildcat, flown with discipline and backed by industrial might, was proving that victory did not always belong to the fastest or the most beautiful design. Sometimes it belonged to the fighter that refused to die. And nowhere was this more evident than in the battles that followed. The turning points where the Wildcat faced its greatest test and began to rewrite the story of the Pacific Air War. The Solomons, August 1942. The United States launched its first major offensive of the Pacific War, an invasion of Guadalcanal. The target was the unfinished Japanese airfield at Lunga Point, soon to be known as Henderson Field. Capturing it meant controlling a vital point on the sea lanes to Australia. For the Japanese, losing it was unthinkable. As Marines dug in on the island, air power became the lifeline. From dawn to dusk, Japanese bombers and fighters streamed south from Rabaul, escorted by the deadly Zeros. The men who stood in their path were a patchwork of Navy, Marine, and Army pilots flying Wildcats from the rough strip at Henderson. Together, they became known as the Cactus Air Force, named after the Allied code name for Guadalcanal. For the Wildcat pilots, conditions were brutal. The runway was crude coral, littered with craters from shelling. Supplies were scarce. Mechanics worked without hangars, repairing shot-up planes in open fields under constant threat of attack. Every takeoff was a gamble. Enemy bombers overhead, strafing raids, or the ever-present risk of mechanical failure in the tropical heat. Against this backdrop, the Wildcat faced the Zero day after day. In the air, the imbalance was clear. The Zero could outclimb and outturn the American fighter with ease. Japanese pilots often dove into combat confident they could dictate the fight. Yet the men of the Cactus Air Force had learned their lessons. They refused to turn. They dived instead, using the Wildcat's sturdiness to plunge through the attack, then rolled back with guns blazing. Here, the Wildcat's durability became a weapon. Pilots returned from sorties with shredded wings, punctured fuselages, and bullet-scarred cockpits, yet alive. Survivors told of Zeros bursting into flame after only a few hits from the Wildcat's heavy machine guns. The laughter of Japanese aviators, once confident in their superiority, began to waver as attrition mounted. One Marine pilot, Major John L. Smith, emerged as a symbol of this resilience. Flying Wildcats from Henderson, he shot down multiple Japanese planes during the campaign, ultimately earning the Medal of Honor. His experience echoed that of many others. Patience, discipline, and reliance on the Wildcat's armor gave him chances that would have been impossible in a lighter machine. The thatch weave also proved decisive. Guadalcanal's skies often saw outnumbered American pairs face swarms of Zeros. By weaving back and forth, covering each other's tails, they turned Japanese aggression into vulnerability. Again and again, Zeros diving on one Wildcat found themselves torn apart by the guns of the other. The air battles over Guadalcanal were not clean duels. They were grinding contests of endurance. The Japanese launched raid after raid, hoping to starve the Marines and reclaim the airfield. Each time, Wildcats scrambled into the sky to meet them. Losses were heavy on both sides, but the strain weighed more heavily on Japan. Every Zero pilot lost was irreplaceable. Every Wildcat downed could, in time, be replaced by America's growing industry. By November 1942, the balance was shifting. The Cactus Air Force had bled the Japanese of both aircraft and pilots. Though the Wildcat never outperformed the Zero in raw speed or agility, it did what was required. It survived, it fought, and it wore down an enemy that could not afford attrition. For the first time in the war, the Zero's legend of invincibility was cracking. Reports from Guadalcanal told a different story than the early months of 1942. The slow Wildcat, once ridiculed, was now a proven defender, its guns shredding Japanese planes from the sky, its pilots gaining confidence in tactics that turned survival into victory, and the lessons of Guadalcanal would carry forward. The next great tests, the carrier battles of Midway, Santa Cruz, and the long struggle for the Solomon Islands, would show that this underdog fighter, mocked at first, could hold the line in the most decisive clashes of the Pacific War. Before Guadalcanal became the grinding crucible of the Pacific, there was Midway. June 1942, a desperate gamble by the Imperial Japanese Navy to crush the American carrier force. The stage was set for one of the most decisive battles in naval history. And the Wildcat, though overshadowed by dive bombers and torpedo planes, played a critical role. At Midway, Wildcats flew as escorts for the slower torpedo bombers of VT squadrons. Theirs was a grim duty. Against swarms of Zeros, the torpedo planes suffered appalling losses. But the Wildcats fought with ferocity, diving into the melee to buy seconds for their comrades. Many were shot down. Those who survived inflicted wounds that slowed Japanese fighters just enough to leave their carriers exposed to dive bomber strikes. The eventual destruction of 4 Japanese carriers was not the Wildcats' victory alone, but without its stubborn defense, the opportunity might never have come. Months later, at the Battle of Santa Cruz in October 1942, the Wildcat again bore the brunt of combat air patrols. American carriers Hornet and Enterprise faced overwhelming Japanese attacks. Zeros and dive bombers poured through, and Wildcats scrambled to intercept. It was here that the resilience of the Grumman design shone. Pilots returned to their decks in aircraft shredded by cannon fire, limping on shot-out controls, but still flying. For every Wildcat lost, there was often a Japanese fighter or bomber that never returned. Individual stories captured the shift in momentum. Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, flying a Wildcat from USS Lexington in early 1942, had already become a national hero by single-handedly attacking a formation of Japanese bombers, shooting down 5 in one sortie. At Midway, Marine ace Captain Marion Carl scored multiple kills, proving that the supposed mismatch between Wildcat and Zero was not absolute. Later, on Guadalcanal, Major John L. Smith and Captain Joe Foss racked up tallies that rivaled those of Japanese aces. Each story carried the same theme. The Wildcat demanded discipline, courage, and teamwork. Pilots who flew recklessly often perished. Those who trusted their tactics, who used dives and weaves rather than turns, turned survival into victory. Meanwhile, Japan was bleeding. At Coral Sea, Midway, Eastern Solomons, and Santa Cruz, the Imperial Navy lost not just aircraft, but something far more precious: veteran pilots. These men, forged in the skies over China, had been the backbone of Japanese aerial supremacy. By late 1942, too many of them had fallen, and Japan had no system capable of replacing them quickly. Training new aviators took years, but war demanded replacements in months. The skill gap that had once favored Japan began to close. The Wildcat was central to this attrition. Each duel in the skies, each thatch weave executed over Guadalcanal, each desperate defense above a carrier group chipped away at Japan's irreplaceable pool of aces. The laughter that had once greeted the clumsy American fighter gave way to frustration and loss. The Zero could still outturn, still climb faster, but those advantages no longer guaranteed victory against disciplined Wildcat formations. By early 1943, the legend of the Zero was broken. Reports from the front noted that American pilots no longer feared the encounter. They respected the Zero's agility, but understood its fragility. They knew that if they fought smart, if they trusted the strengths of their own machine, they had as much chance of winning as their opponent, sometimes more. This was the turning point. The Wildcat did not become the best fighter in the Pacific. It never was. But it became something more important: the fighter that held the line, bled the enemy, and carried U.S. naval aviation through the darkest months of the war. Its guns, its armor, and its tactics shredded Japanese confidence and eroded the myth of invincibility. From Midway to Guadalcanal to Santa Cruz, the Wildcat proved that wars are not won by perfection alone. They are won by endurance, adaptation, and the will to keep fighting long after elegance has burned away. And as 1942 gave way to 1943, the aftermath of these battles revealed just how decisive this endurance had been, not just for individual pilots, but for the balance of the entire Pacific War. By the end of 1942, the Pacific Air War looked very different from its beginning. The Japanese Zero still cut a formidable profile in the sky, but its aura of invincibility was gone. The Wildcat, derided as slow, mocked as outdated, had proven its worth in the hardest way possible, through attrition and survival. Numbers tell the story. In combat over Guadalcanal alone, Marine and Navy pilots flying Wildcats achieved kill-to-loss ratios approaching 5-to-1. Across the entire early Pacific campaign, from Wake Island to the Solomons, the Wildcats scored more than 1,500 confirmed kills. For every Wildcat lost, several Japanese planes, often more valuable Zeros, were destroyed. This balance of attrition mattered deeply, for unlike the United States, Japan could not sustain its losses. American industry was the Wildcats' invisible ally. Grumman's factory on Long Island turned out aircraft at a pace unimaginable in Tokyo. Even as Wildcats were being replaced by newer Hellcats and Corsairs, production continued to keep frontline squadrons supplied. If a Wildcat was shot down, another waited on the deck of a carrier or in a stateside hangar, ready to be flown across the Pacific. Japan had no such cushion. Each Zero that fell represented not just the loss of a machine, but of an experienced pilot trained under a pre-war system that emphasized years of rigorous preparation. When those men perished, they could not be replaced quickly. By 1943, Japanese squadrons were increasingly filled with green recruits, brave, but lacking the instincts and reflexes honed by combat veterans. The Wildcat accelerated this drain. Though outperformed in pure speed and agility, its toughness meant American pilots often survived battles that should have ended in flames. Self-sealing fuel tanks and cockpit armor saved countless lives. Pilots who lived to fight another day carried with them lessons, experience, and confidence. Japanese pilots who went down rarely had the same chance. This survival effect was as important as the kill tallies. A U.S. aviator who returned to his carrier, even in a battered Wildcat, became more dangerous with every mission. Over time, squadrons of such men formed a hardened core, their growing skill offsetting the technical limitations of their planes. Strategically, the Wildcat ensured that American carriers could keep fighting. At Coral Sea, Midway, and Santa Cruz, these stubby fighters intercepted waves of Japanese bombers, blunting attacks that might otherwise have crippled the fleet. Losses were heavy, but enough bombers were turned back, enough torpedoes splashed harmlessly into the sea, that the carriers lived to strike back. The preservation of those carriers was decisive. Without them, there would have been no Midway victory, no Guadalcanal campaign, no foothold from which to launch the eventual march across the Pacific. For Japan, the consequence was a slow but inexorable shift. Each battle eroded the margin they had enjoyed in 1941 and early 1942, where once the Zero had dominated through superior maneuverability and elite pilots. Now it faced determined opposition from Wildcats, flown by men who had learned its weaknesses. And so the laughter stopped. The stories of clumsy Wildcats being easy prey no longer matched the reports filtering back from the front. Instead, Japanese pilots spoke of disciplined American formations, of deadly crossing patterns, of machine gun bursts that tore through wings and engines in an instant. The Wildcat was never glamorous, never sleek. It was, as its designer Leroy Grumman once said, a tough little fighter. But toughness was exactly what the U.S. Navy needed in those desperate months of 1942. It was a bridge, carrying America from vulnerability to resilience, from ridicule to respect. And by the time newer, faster fighters like the Hellcat and Corsair arrived in 1943, the Wildcat had already done its job. It had broken the myth of the Zero, held the line at sea, and given America time to bring the full weight of its industry and manpower to bear. The aftermath of that contribution would stretch far beyond individual dogfights into the grand strategy of the Ayujuan Pacific War itself. By early 1943, the Wildcats' chapter in the front line was drawing to a close. New aircraft were arriving, the F-6F Hellcat, faster, heavier armed, and designed specifically to counter the Zero, and the F-4U Corsair, a beast of speed and power. Compared to these new machines, the Wildcat looked even more outdated, yet its place in history was already secure. The Wildcat had bought the time America needed. It had carried the Navy and Marines through the darkest months of the war. ensuring that carriers survived long enough for the new generation of aircraft to reach the fleet. By the time the Hellcat entered combat in mid-1943, American aviators were not novices. They were hardened veterans, many of whom had cut their teeth flying Wildcats over the Solomons. Their experience, paid for in blood and attrition, made them lethal from the moment they strapped into their new planes. Japan, by contrast, was faltering. Losses suffered in 1942 and early 1943 had gutted its elite corps of pilots. The new generation lacked both training and equipment. By 1944, Japan would increasingly turn to desperate measures: rushed training programs, ill-equipped air groups, and eventually, the kamikaze. The seeds of that desperation had been planted in the battles where Wildcats shredded the confidence of Zero pilots and cut down Japan's ability to fight on equal terms. Even after it was replaced on the fleet carriers, the Wildcat did not disappear. It continued to serve from small escort carriers, jeep carriers that could not launch the heavier Hellcat or Corsair. In the Atlantic, Wildcats flew as convoy defenders, shooting down German reconnaissance planes and fending off long-range bombers. In the Pacific, they supported amphibious operations, providing close air support for Marines storming ashore. The little fighter remained relevant, even as more advanced aircraft stole the spotlight. For the men who flew it, the Wildcat earned a reputation that lingered long after the war. Pilots remembered its quirks, its manual landing gear crank, which took nearly 30 turns to raise after takeoff, its stubborn handling at low speeds, its refusal to match the elegance of the Zero. But they also remembered its virtues. It could take punishment. It could bring them home. It gave them a fighting chance when the odds seemed overwhelming. The statistics reinforced the memory. Wildcats finished the war with a kill-to-loss ratio of around 6-to-1, remarkable for a plane that began its service underestimated and ridiculed. In the context of the early Pacific War, those numbers were not just victories in the air, but building blocks of strategic momentum. Looking back, historians have often described the Wildcat as a transitional aircraft. But that word does not capture its true impact. It was more than a stepping stone. It was a shield, absorbing the worst blows of Japan's air arm, standing firm while America prepared its counterpunch. Without it, the timeline of the Pacific War might have been very different. Carrier decks stripped of their defenses could have been destroyed. Islands like Guadalcanal might never have been held, and the long march across the Pacific might have been delayed, or even derailed. The Japanese Zero, once feared as untouchable, would eventually face annihilation at the hands of Hellcats and Corsairs. But the process of breaking its legend began much earlier. Over Midway, over Guadalcanal, above the heaving decks of carriers under fire, when Wildcats refused to die quietly. Thus, the legacy of the Wildcat is not one of glamour, but of grit. It is the story of an aircraft that outlived ridicule, defied mockery, and proved that survival, persistence, and courage could reshape the balance of war. The stage was now set for reflection, to ask what this unlikely fighter meant, not only to the men who flew it, but to the larger story of the Second World War. History often remembers the champions of speed, power, and brilliance, the shining machines that dazzled the eye and seemed to embody superiority. In the Pacific War, that was the Zero, an aircraft born of daring engineering, light, agile, and for a time, untouchable. Yet, when the war was done, it was not the Zero that shaped the outcome. It was the Wildcat, an aircraft that lacked elegance, that could not outturn or outclimb, but that endured. It survived long enough for its pilots to learn, to adapt, to pass on their knowledge. In doing so, it became more than a machine. It became a vessel of resilience. The story of the Wildcat is the story of a truth often forgotten in war, that survival can be as decisive as victory. Nations that endure the first blows, that hold firm through hardship, gain the time and space to summon their strength. The United States found that endurance in the Wildcat, and through it, discovered the path to ultimate supremacy in the air. For the men who flew it, the Wildcat was not a perfect weapon, but a trusted companion. It carried them through storms of fire, across seas of flame, into battles where odds seemed impossible. Its guns roared not with grace, but with the steady defiance of men who refused to yield. And for history, it stands as a reminder that wars are not always won by the fastest or the sleekest. Sometimes they are won by the aircraft that simply refuses to fall, by the crews who wring every ounce of strength from its frame, and by the quiet, relentless grind of endurance against brilliance. The Zero began the Pacific War as a symbol of fear. The Wildcat ended it as a symbol of resolve. And in that transformation lies one of the most enduring lessons of the Second World War. That in the crucible of conflict, it is not mockery or glamour that decides the future, but resilience, sacrifice, and the will to fight on.